Hello, my name is Jeffrey Hall, and I'm the Research and Development Director for Vatanco USA. Vatanco Argentina expanded into the United States last year. We have set up a research and development laboratory area in St. Paul, Minnesota, which is in the heart of the Upper Midwest Swine Production Center. We're also located about 3.5 kilometers away from the renowned University of Minnesota Swine Center, which provides us access to many researchers and collaborations and tools to utilize during our research and development work. Uh, we Botanco remains focused on biotech vac salmonella and its poultry platform, but here in the U.S., we've been interested in expanding the biotech vac platform into swine. We have 3 vaccines that we're very, excited about to be working on. The first one is a Salmonella E. coli vaccine for young nursing piglets, and that'll be a combination vaccine in theory. And the second vaccine is a Streptococcus suis vaccine, which we're very excited about. We have just started initial immunological studies in pigs with that vaccine, and we're currently analyzing those in the lab right now. But much like biotech vac salmonella, that covers many salmonella serotypes in the field, in poultry at least, we expect similar cross-serotype protection for Streptococcus suis. So this is very exciting and would be the first on the market. So those are the couple of things that we're working on here. I would like to introduce Todd Thurman. He's an international swine management consultant and has been in the business, I believe, for 20 years or more. He has clients all over the United States and internationally. He's a wealth of information and has a lot of knowledge and just information about what's going on with COVID-19 here in the United States as it relates to live production and on the slaughterhouse side. For a while, we had a large impact and slowdown as there were outbreaks of COVID-19 in the slaughterhouses and on farms. Some of that has been mitigated, but much like the rest of the world, we're just beginning to kind of live with the virus in the US. I hope you all are well and stay safe, and thank you.
Hi, my name is Todd Thurman with SwineTech's Consulting Services. We are a swine management consulting firm based just outside of Fort Worth, Texas, and we provide consulting and training services to pork producers around the globe. I wanted to spend some time today to talk to you about the current situation with COVID-19 in the US and its impact on the pork processing sector specifically, and more generally, the pig industry in the US. So I want to start with a little bit of background information. The US pork processing industry is already highly consolidated and has been for several years. The top 4 producers in the US, so the top 4 processors of pork in the US, control about 72% of the total market. So those producers would be Smithfield Foods, Tyson Foods, JBS, and then the combination of Triumph and Seaboard Foods. As you might expect, with a consolidated industry, the plants are quite large. We have 8 plants here in the US that operate at a capacity of over 20,000 head per day. Each of those represents about 4%, at least 4% of the total production in the industry. We have an additional 17 plants that can process more than 10,000 head per day. And then we have a total of about 30 plants that can process at least 1,000 head a day. And that represents the vast majority of the overall production. So very consolidated industry, very large plants on average. To give you an idea where those plants are located, I'd like to share a map here that I think will be useful. So this is a map that represents all US pork processing locations. So this would be everything from sausage plants to kill cut to further processing. So any plant that handles any sort of pork product. As you can see, there's a heavy concentration here in the Midwest, which is where the corn and soybeans are grown. And that's where most of the pork production is. There's also another fairly heavy concentration of pork production in the East Coast around North Carolina. So not unexpectedly, we have several plants in that area, but very heavily focused on the Midwest. So the impact of COVID-19 has been really the biggest, most noticeable impact has been on plant closures. So we've had plant closures that started back in early April. We had the plant in Columbus Junction, Iowa, that closed on April 8th. And that's really when this concern within the industry really started. So I've got a timeline here we can go through really quickly that will help explain the kind of the timeline of these major plant closures. So here's a timeline of the major plant closures. There have been other smaller plants that have closed that had impact. But as I mentioned before, on April 8th, the Columbus Junction plant of Tyson's in Iowa closed, 10,000 head. April 10th, just a couple of days later, the plant in Sioux Falls owned by Smithfield closed. That was a larger plant processing almost 20,000 head a day. And then we had 3 days in a row where we had major plant closings. A few weeks later, starting on April 21st, when JBS closed its Worthington, Minnesota plant that processes 21,000 head, and Tyson closed their Waterloo, Iowa, and Logansport, Indiana plants on consecutive days. Those two plants combined process about 35,000 head. And then a few days later, Smithfield announced that Monmouth, Illinois, a 10,000 head plant, was going to be closing. And then on May 5th, the last major announcement, we had Tyson announcing that they were closing the Madison, Nebraska plant that processes about 8,000 head. So that gives you an idea of sort of the timeline of the major plant closings. Those plant closures have lasted on average about 10 days. So they've kind of ranged from maybe 2 or 3 days up to 2 weeks or a little bit longer, but most have been in that 10-day range. The reopenings after the closures have almost all been partial. So very few, if any, have returned immediately to full capacity. So even when they do reintroduce production, it's almost always at a significantly reduced rate that they expect and hope that they'll be able to increase over time. I do think it's really important to understand that the impact on the industry has not just been with plant closures. Obviously, those closures have a major impact on the industry and kind of grab most of the headlines and generate most of the concern. But almost all of the plants in the US have had some impact in terms of slowdowns. So they've had absenteeism issues where people are not showing up for work because either they're sick and they're afraid maybe they have COVID-19, or they're afraid of contracting COVID-19, or they've heard rumors that there was some outbreaks at the plants. Whatever the reason, absenteeism has been driving slower line speeds, shorter shifts, just overall reduction in capacity. So even these plants that haven't experienced any actual closures are still dealing with challenges related to the absenteeism in the plants and not being able to operate at full capacity. By May 12th, all of the pork processing facilities in the U.S. were open and operating at some capacity. Now, that certainly doesn't mean they were operating at full capacity. They weren't. But finally, we kind of passed that milestone where all plants were in operation at some capacity at the same time, and that was on May 12th, and has held true since then. Currently, the industry is operating by our estimates at about 80% capacity. That varies from day to day, from week to week, but that's a good estimate, I think, in terms of where we're at today, around that 82% of capacity. At our lowest point in early May, the industry was operating at about 62% capacity. And so, as you can imagine, that's a significant reduction in capacity of nearly 40%, which was extremely problematic. We expect, nobody knows exactly what's going to happen, but we expect as we look at the future that we may get to that 85 to 90% range in terms of operating capacity, and that the industry may struggle to get past that and may sort of get stuck at that 85 to 90% range. And that may stretch out for another 6 to 8 weeks as we sort through some of these issues and try to get these issues resolved and come up with plans that allow us to operate at 100% capacity. The decisions on these plant shutdowns have largely been left to plants themselves. There is an executive order in place in the US from the president that the plants have to stay open. But obviously, if they're not able to actually operate, they're maybe open in effect or in name, but not in effect because they don't have people to actually operate the plants. In one case, the plant was shut down when they had 80 cases of COVID-19, but really it's more about the patterns that are developing and the way the employees are responding to the perceived risk, and then the way the company itself evaluates that risk and the decision-making processes that they go through. So there's no real clear pattern. There's no clear process for deciding, when to shut a plant down or how to deal with this. Nobody's got a handbook on this issue, and so we're really, these individual companies, these individual managers have been trying to sort through this and trying to make the best decisions they can, both for their business and in the interest of their employees. Local health departments, national organization, government agencies at the state and national level have all provided recommendations in a general sense, but there's been no clear communication on exactly what processes have to be followed. And so it's a very difficult environment for these decision makers, both at the governmental level and obviously at the level of the businesses, to make a decision on how to deal with these potential plant closures and with the impact of COVID-19 on their operations. Some of the actions that have been taken in the plants include implementing social distancing when it's appropriate, but that's understandably extremely difficult in these plants. There's a lot of people working in a relatively small area. So when they can't provide social distancing, when that's not practical, they've been erecting barriers in between those people to provide some protection. And then obviously there's been a lot of discussion about personal protection equipment, masks, face shields, gloves, things of that nature. There also has been a lot of discussion about testing and isolation procedures, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but that has been a part of the process so far and figures to become a bigger part of the process in the near future. And then there's been a lot of discussion about adjusting breaks and shift schedules in order to adjust for those reduced interaction between employees. I want to give you just a short chart here that I think will help explain the overall situation. So this is the weekly slaughter data from the USDA, from the government reports. And the white column represents 2020, and the red column represents 2019, the same time period in 2019. We start out here in early April. This is the report for the week ending April 4th. And we see here that the blue column, 2020, we were actually quite a bit ahead of the 2019, which is expected. It's a very important thing for you to understand, is that we had record production leading up to this situation. And so we had an historically high number of animals that were being produced in the US and were needing to be processed. And so if you go back even further, you'll see that we were consistently above the 2019 levels, and obviously since we were at historic levels, we're consistently above the 3-year, 5-year averages. So this came at a very inopportune time for the industry in terms of having to deal with these increasing number of hogs because we already had more hogs than we'd ever been dealing with before. So as you can see, as we move into April, and particularly into the early part of May, we started to see this reduction in capacity. So these slaughter numbers started to go down. And then we reached our low, as I mentioned earlier. This would be the week ending May the 2nd. So that was when we had the biggest impact. Since then, we've started to come back and kind of worked our way up to something very close to normal. The last report we got from the USDA was for the week ending March the 23rd. So these last numbers you see here represent that time period. And as you can see, it's sort of reflective of where we're at currently, as I mentioned earlier, around 80% of capacity. So in terms of current run rates, I said the industry is operating at about 80, 82% capacity right now. If we look at the big players in the industry, Smithfield's operating at about 72% across their whole business. JBS has fared a little better, operating about 86% of their total capacity. Tyson was a little worse, operating at about 70% of their total capacity. Triumph Seaboard and Hormel are both about 75% of capacity. And then the Clemens Food Group is, from my best understanding, is currently operating at close to 100% capacity. As far as I'm aware, they're the only major producer that is operating at 100% or very close to 100%. They are in a slightly different geographic area. Their plants are in Pennsylvania and Coldwater, Michigan. And so that may have some impact on their the situation that they're dealing with. But they're the only major producer that I'm aware of that's operating anywhere close to that at this point. I'll take a step back and talk a little bit about the pig industry as a whole and sort of where we're at in terms of the pig industry. The plant closures and the slowdowns have created a very unusual situation in our industry where we basically have very high pork prices, very low pig prices. And so the disruption there is in the processing. And so that's created a very unusual scenario where pigs are not worth much money, but pork is worth a lot of money. And so when we have that disruption in that processing segment, it creates a strange situation for the industry to deal with. Our supply chains from a live production standpoint are very efficient and very much in sort of an on-time model. And the efficiency is great under most circumstances, but that efficiency contributes to lacks of flexibility or a lack of resiliency. And so what that really means is our pork producers have very limited options when they have a disruption in the processing capabilities. There's not a lot of places for those animals to go. We can create, through management strategies and just in nutrition strategies, can create somewhere between a 2 to 3 week gap, slack. And then beyond that, we really don't have any tools available to us to redirect those animals. And so unlike some of the other livestock and poultry producers that have a little more flexibility, we in the pork industry probably have the least amount of flexibility due just to the biological systems that we're dealing with and then the way the supply chains are set up. And so that has resulted already in the euthanization of quite a few market hogs. So these are hogs that were ready to go to market. There was no place for them to go, and they had to be euthanized, which is obviously a very difficult decision for everyone involved. Not only is it a costly decision, but it's also a very difficult situation for any farmer to have to take the product that they've spent so much time and money and effort in producing and seeing it go to waste like that. No one knows exactly how many animals have been euthanized. We estimate that there may have already been as many as 2 million animals euthanized. And I'm talking about market animals, not weaned pigs. Would not be included in that number. Depending on where we end up and how long this thing stretches out, we could be in a situation where we have to euthanize as many as 10 million market hogs, which is obviously a devastating situation that's very difficult for those of us in the industry to deal with. In terms of profitability, as you might not be surprised to hear, profitability for the pork producer, for the farmer, has not been good. We've varied anywhere over the last several weeks from around break even to about a $40 per head loss, USD. And so that doesn't include any of the losses when we talk about the profitability. That's not really factoring any of those losses that might be associated with having to euthanize, fully grown market hogs. So those are animals, obviously, that we have all of the expenses invested in, and when we're euthanizing them, we're going to get, virtually no revenue in return for. In fact, there's a disposal cost associated with those animals. So when we talk about profitability levels and the impact on producers, it's not just that profitability and that loss per head that we're calculating, but there's an additional loss for those producers that have been in the unfortunate situation to have to euthanize animals. In terms of prices, the prices, again, have been low. Weaned pig price currently in the U.S. is averaging around $7 a head. It has been below zero at a few points where you literally couldn't give away weaned pigs. To give you an idea, current revenue around $7 a head. Cost of production for a weaned pig in the U.S. is usually around $35 to $40. So that's obviously a big loss for anybody that's selling weaned pigs. Feeder pigs that weigh about 40 pounds or somewhere around 20 kilos, prices currently hovering around $18 a head. So obviously, if you've got $35 to $40 already invested in those weaned pigs, then $18 a head is going to result in a pretty significant loss for those producers selling feeder pigs as well. Again, we've had situations where feeder pigs in the very recent past were, basically for a year. They were giving away, and in some cases paying to have them picked up. The market price results in about $145 per head revenue, which is about the production cost. So right now we're projecting animals that are going to market today are right about break even. Over the last several weeks, we've had losses as high as $40 plus for the average producer. And so obviously that varies individually based on performance levels and risk management strategies that might be in place. But as an industry average, or the typical producer has been basically breaking even, anywhere from break even to losing about $40 per head. And again, that doesn't account for those animals that had to be euthanized. So that's an additional economic strain on those producers. Based on the current futures prices, if we project out based on where we're at currently in the futures market, which has been relatively volatile, we're predicting continued losses for some time to come. Over the next 6 months or so, we're projecting that we're probably going to see losses between $10 and $35 per head. So we're not very optimistic that we're going to see much improvement in the pig side. Hopefully we stabilize and we can eliminate that need to euthanize animals in the very near future. But the future doesn't look great in terms of the supply and demand economics. And so that's why the futures markets are pretty pessimistic, pretty bearish in terms when it comes to pig prices. Pork prices, again, we expect to stay relatively high because there's going to be a reduction in supply. Again, very strange situation, very unusual situation that we have on the markets. To kind of wrap up, I'd like to spend just a little bit of time talking about the future. It may be a little premature to talk about the future because we're still very much right in the middle of this thing. But I do think that we have some learnings that may be useful to other people in different parts of the world that are either experiencing now or going to be experiencing the similar issues in the future. And then certainly, some of us in the industry have begun thinking about already what kind of changes can we make to make our industry more resilient. And I think really what we're looking at is an understanding that the efficiency that we've built into our system has been very valuable under normal circumstances, made us very competitive as an industry. But those same things that we've done to create efficiency have reduced our resiliency. And so we've learned that our supply chains, although they're very efficient and under normal circumstances work very well, when we do have disruptions that are admittedly rare, like COVID-19, it creates problems, many problems that our industry is not well equipped to deal with. And so I think as we think about that and moving forward in terms of thinking about bigger picture items, I think we'll start looking at plant designs and we'll kind of revisit some of those and possibly looking at smaller plants or at least plants that operate like smaller plants. I think we're going to see more automation, and I think a lot of that automation is going to be more oriented towards artificial intelligence that allows us to provide automation, but also deal with some of the variation in a product because these are, biological systems that we're dealing with. And so I think as we kind of implement some of those more artificial intelligence-oriented automation procedures in the plants, I think we'll have the ability to reduce the labor force in the plants that will help address a lot of issues. And I think that's important because as we look at efforts to increase resiliency, they often end up reducing our efficiency. So we're going to have to create some flexibility, but we're going to have to give up some efficiency in order to do that, which is going to result in higher production costs and then higher prices for consumers. Innovation is one way that we can skip that. And so in some ways, if we are able to be innovative and come up with some solutions, we might be able to make some improvements in resiliency without giving away anything in terms of efficiency, or without giving away as much as inefficiency as we might have without that technology. And so obviously, as we move forward, we're going to be looking at trying to minimize people in these plants. And then for the people that are working in the plants, we're going to look at ways we can minimize the amount of interaction that's required for them to operate in the plants. The other thing that we're obviously going to see is an increase in health screenings. Virus and antibody testing is almost certainly going to be part of those procedures. And then the employee isolation programs, anything related to that is going to play a very prominent role in future management of this challenge. And so those are some of the things that I expect to see in the coming weeks and months that will be changes for our industry. And this is going to have a long tail. So we're going to still be talking about this impact for not only weeks and months, but also years to come. And I think it's going to have an impact on how we continue to develop and how we expand and how we reevaluate the facilities and the supply chains that we have today. So anyway, I'll end with that, and I hope that provides some information. Again, there is a lot more questions than there is answers still. But I certainly hope that some of our learnings here in the U.S. can be useful to our colleagues in other parts of the world that are either dealing with these challenges now or going to be dealing with these challenges in the future. And so hopefully I've been able to share some information that's been useful and certainly will be available for any additional interaction. If you have any other questions, certainly don't hesitate to reach out to us. Our website is www.swinetex.com. That's SWINETEX.com. All of our contact information is there. So please feel free to reach out if there's anything that we can be of assistance in. Thank you for your time, and I appreciate the opportunity to share this information with you.